Good morning. Hello, Green Spring. Today is Wednesday, July 8th, 2015, and I'm Fran Duval, your host for today, and I'm just so pleased to welcome, I don't think I've ever done a show with Jack Lentz before, but I'm very happy to be the host to you, Jack Lentz, resident of Maple Creek, for 15 years or something.
Not quite, going on 13.
Okay. A little longer than I'm in that same building, but I was
But we knew each other early on.
Right, right.
Yep.
So, Jack, you're going to talk about a person named Aaron Burr, who was in our very early history of this country. So, what do you have to say about him?
A very interesting guy. Would you think born in 1756, died in 1836. If you do some subtraction, you find out he was 80 years old. But 1756, there wasn't even the United States of America. And of course, when he died, it was Martin Van Buren was the president. We had gone through Andrew Jackson with his democratic change to the government. And so a war of 1812, and the nation had proved itself capable of being dealt with by the powers of Europe and still subsisting. Also, we had the land grant, the Louisiana Purchase, which opened up the America. The settlers crossed the Appalachian and had all this land, and all the land grabbers were all out for grabbing it, and yet that was only part. They wanted to go to the ocean because Lewis and Thomas Clark had touched the Pacific Ocean. This was our national destiny, if you will. And that we accomplished, of course, in the war with Mexico, the Mexican War of the 40s, 18, and so forth. So.
That's the period of time we're talking about. Yeah.
And he was really a man for that time.
Uh-huh.
And when you think of what he was called, he was a patriot, yes, he was a soldier. He was a traitor, was he? He was a murderer, all these names. He was certainly a woman's man. And aren't we all in a way? I mean, aspects of that are in all of us, I guess. So, just an interesting person in a very interesting period of our national development.
Mm-hmm. And so where do you begin with talking about Aaron? Well, what did you say you listened to a talking book about him? Or,
yes.
And what was that book?
Well, it's done by Nancy Eider.
I don't know that.
Yeah, I have her name, Eisenberg, I believe.
Okay.
Very good. You know, you have so many books on Thomas Jefferson, what, 75, I see, sticks in mind, my last count. Hamilton has quite a few, but you don't find too many on Aaron Burr.
Mm-hmm.
And what you find, they're either for him to the limit, or they're against him.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to try to get a neutral one, and I think this Nancy Eisenberg one that I listened to convinced me, or she certainly presented both sides of the man. And it's up to you to make your distinction. Was he a traitor? Was he our second Benedict Arnold? Or was he just a man of the time who wanted to use his God-given intelligence and for the nation?
You called him a nation builder earlier when you and I were speaking before we went on the air.
Yes.
That was one of his missions in a way, or
It
his attributes.
Well, after his trial in 1807 in Richmond, this was for treachery, for accused of being a traitor. He was acquitted by Chief Justice John Marshall, who said that treason exists only when you're at war with the country. You could see it in the case of Benedict Arnold. We were at war with Britain. He was at West Point and had turned over the plans of West Point to the British, but we weren't at war in this particular instance. So Marshall, it was not. One source I read said it wasn't one of Marshall's best decisions.
Oh,
We looked to
see?
him as one of the great men of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, right.
But he acquitted him and said, as I said earlier, that treason exists only when you are at war with a country.
Mm-hmm.
So after that, really, Burr was a man without a country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what did he do? He went abroad to see if he could get any support from nations, and boy, he covered them all.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll get into that a little.
Okay.
Where do we begin? All right. 1756, he was born in, do you know where he was born?
I want to say New York, but I could be wrong.
Newark, New Jersey.
New Jersey, okay.
And
I was close.
You were close, you were close. And what were they doing there? Well, his father, Aaron Burr, Sr., was a respected clergyman and had been called to be the second president of the College of New Jersey, which we know as
Princeton.
Yeah. So the family was there waiting for construction of, I guess, one of the buildings on campus to be completed. And he had a sister, Sally, 2 years older than himself, and they moved. And what happened? Both his parents took ill and died, and there you had these poor orphans. So what did they do? The university called his maternal grandfather, who was Jonathan Edwards, perhaps the Billy Graham of his age, the fire and brimstone preacher. And he came down to assume the presidency of Princeton, and he and his wife caught a disease and both died. So there you had, for these orphans, if you will, or these poor Burr kids, Sally and Aaron, they had lost their parents and their grandparents. Well, their uncle, Timothy Edwards, who had a large family of his own, took them on, and really they became part of that. They had plenty of cousins to play with, and also Timothy knew the importance of education to the Burrs, particularly Mrs. Burr, Sarah Burr. And so he saw that Aaron would continue that. And he had friends who had a school outside of, not too far from Princeton, at Elizabethtown, New Jersey. I think Elizabeth exists today. The town has been dropped.
Yeah.
Anyway, and so Aaron was enrolled in that school. And at age 13, he was a bright guy. He applied for admission to the College of to Princeton, we'll call it. And he was turned back and said, "You're too young." You can imagine 13, take a couple more years. So he took a couple more years, and at age 15, reapplied, and they took him on. In fact, even let him skip the first grade, so he began, I guess you'd call, as a sophomore. Did well, was popular. He was called Little Burr. He was never a big man, 5'6", 5'7", something like that. And enjoyed his college years, joined the Clio Club, which was a debating society and social, and also the Whig Party, which he organized there at Princeton. And then they were caught in the revolutionary fervor and joined the Benedict Arnold Brigade that was aimed at Quebec. Quebec in Canada, of course, was always something that he wanted to capture. In the War of 1812, they spent the whole 4 or 5 years of the war trying to take Quebec and never did. But anyway, so he joined, and there he met Benedict Arnold. I don't know that they were especially good friends, but Arnold made him the liaison with General Montgomery, who was to approach Quebec from the left, if you will, whereas this was a direct joining Montgomery for an assault on Quebec. Well, Montgomery was a little hasty. He got there for a frontal attack, and he got himself shot. So then it was Burr who tried to get the body of Montgomery so it could be brought back for burial. And of course, the British claimed that they buried him there in the snows of Quebec. Interesting in that connection, in the group was a fellow from Princeton who was a bit of an artist, and he had drawn a picture of Burr carrying the body of Montgomery out of Quebec, if you will, for burial, which of course the British had already buried him. But that was funny because a 5'7" guy carrying a 6'2", 3 person on his shoulder was a bit much. So after that, he joined the George Washington's Continental Army and was aide-de-camp to Israel Putnam, you might remember,
Right.
was the hero of Bunker Hill. Was with him and, of course, suffered with Washington the loss of Long Island and also Manhattan, probably George Washington's nadir, lowest time in his career.
Right.
It was so low that the people were claiming that he'd be succeeded, and they had General Charles Lee as his successor. This never came about. Of course, Washington redeemed himself in his Christmas crossing of the Delaware there at Trenton, where he came upon the Hessian soldiers who were enjoying their holiday. And then there were the war, the Valley Forge, or the winter at Valley Forge, 77, 78. Burr experienced that. And after, he was getting tired of the war. It was nothing that really appealed to him. But he did show his bravery in the Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey. He was lieutenant colonel. That was another thing. A lot of his fellow mates had joined Washington's staff, and they were now generals, and he was only a light colonel, if you will. And so after the Battle of Monmouth, he wrote a letter of resignation to Washington, surrendering his commission, and there he was. What was he going to do next? Was he going to go back to theology? I think not. And the next thing for him was to become a lawyer. So he took time, went up to Albany, took a 3-year course. He finished it in true Burr fashion in 2 years, and then was able to come to New York and establish an office. And I should say, in the meantime, he had married a wonderful lady, Theodosia.
It sounds like a theatrical name.
Yes.
Theodosia.
Theodosia. She was married to a British officer. And of course, she and Burr had an arduous affair, and divorce was thought of, but they were saved from that because her husband, Theodosia's husband, was transferred to the West Indies, where he died of yellow fever. So they were married. She was 10 years older than Burr. Think of that, Pram. The marriage lasted for 13 years and was a very happy one. In fact, she brought up their daughter, Theodosia, to be a wonderfully educated woman. She patterned it more or less on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's book On a Meal, in which he discussed the education of a young person. So she was very advanced, spoke French fluently. The thing was, she married an older man who became governor of South Carolina, and it was said that she did that only to help her father in his political backings in the South. But anyway, he was always close to his daughter Theodosia and corresponded with her. And then he became interested in establishing the Democratic Party in New York. New York was the biggest state in the Union at that time, and it was, most of it were members of the Federalist Party, whereas Burr and Jefferson were the Democratic Party, or whatever you wanted to call it. But he worked his way into the politics of New York State, being, I think, for 1 year Attorney General, always on a committee, and finally state senator, and then a senator to the U.S. Congress, and he served one term of 6 years. It was not renewed, but at that time you were getting near 1800 or 1801, which was presidential election year. It was a little different at that time. He and Jefferson were rivals for the presidency. Now, they were not a slate, one for president, the other for vice president. That was a much later development, but each went after it independently. And then it was left to the voters, the electoral men.
The Electoral College, or
electoral
what we know as
college,
that
exactly.
now. Yeah.
And can you guess what happened? It was a tie. 73 votes for both of them.
Wow.
And so what do you do with a tie? Well, you would give it to the House of Representatives, and they spent 36 sessions deciding who was going to win the presidency.
Yeah.
And I think Jefferson won by one
vote. Didn't they vote all those 36 times?
Yeah.
They had votes.
Yes, they were sessions for voting, yeah. We've seen that, I mean. And
yeah.
So he was vice president. He and Jefferson were never that close. They were both on the same side as far as politics were concerned. But, and also he knew what the vice presidency meant, more or less in the words of John Nance Garner. You know, it wasn't worth a bucket of warm spit or something like that. And, but he did his duty. And it was during this time, I guess before this time, when he was a practicing lawyer in New York, that he, for a while, partnered with Alexander Hamilton, the darling of Washington, General Hamilton, who was Washington's first Secretary of the Treasury, if you will. But the two of them were on opposite ends. For example, as lawyers, Hamilton appealed to the colonists who had remained with British sympathies, so all their claims were against the revolutionary. You know, Burr, on the other side, was for the American colonists who were suing Britain for damages that they had incurred. So you could see there it was bound to come to a conflict. And also each one, as I say, well, I'll guess a little bit about Hamilton. He was the illegitimate son, well, in the words of John Adams, of a no-good Scotsman who fathered a bastard. So anyway, a bright guy who came to New York, to the U.S. and on business, and applied to Princeton, but he was rejected because of his youth, so he went to the College of New York, which became Columbia University. And so they were practicing lawyers with very different views. Hamilton, of course, being a Federalist, Burr being the Republican or the Democrat. It came to a climax when Hamilton, in a discussion with a doctor friends of his at a dinner, talked about the egregious attacks that Burr had made on him, Hamilton, and also in connection with that mentioned the womanizing aspects of Burr's life. Egregious was the adjective I think he used. Well, you could differ politically with a person. We've had evidence of that, of senators with a cane going to the other side and clubbing someone.
Yeah, right.
But when you attacked a man for what you might call his honor or his personal life, that was something else. That was worthy of a duel. So a duel was arranged, and Hamilton never apologized for what he had said, so Burr said, we will move. So and Burr was now vice president, of course, and Hamilton really was an idol of the population because of his connection with Washington and also his rank as Secretary of Treasury. They met on July 11. It was a steamy, hot, I think Sunday, met at Weehawken, New Jersey. That's where New York and New Jersey seem to meet. Hamilton crossed the Hudson, and on the green there. Now, why they selected that, I can't understand, because dueling was outlawed in both New York and New Jersey.
Yeah, it was against the law to duel, but they managed to do it anyway.
They managed to do it. They got their seconds and the guns they were going to use. And to this day, there is no knowledge of who fired first. I listened on Talking Books to a tape on dueling. It'd be interesting to do a segment on dueling.
Okay.
And because we think of others, for example, the naval hero, Stephen Decatur, who was an upstanding man for the Navy during the War of 1812. He was killed in a duel over some silly, most of the things were rather something that could have been talked through rather than shoot each other. But anyway, and then Andrew Jackson, of course, carried a bullet in his body to his death in defense of the adultery clause of his beloved Rachel. So anyway, where am I? I've lost track.
Well, you were saying they chose that site and until now they never knew who was shooting first, who shot first.
Some claim that Hamilton had fired into an oak tree, the leaves had fallen down. However, Burr, and he was accused of having practiced shooting before shot and mortally killed Hamilton, who was buried with great acclaim. Oh my God. The fatherless horse with the buttons of the boots, rather, hanging from the side of the horse, a la Jackie Kennedy. And so forth. And Burr, remember, was still vice president, so what did he do? Well, he went south, probably to visit his daughter, who was married to the governor of South Carolina, and then returned and took up his duties as vice president and president of the Senate, who at that time were dealing with a case against a member of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, they were impeaching a Supreme Court member.
Exactly. So that was handled by him very deftly, and then he made a very ardent speech to the Congress telling what an important body that was and how he had enjoyed his with them and left. He had wanted to be or become governor of New York, but Hamilton and his crew had stalked that before, and so that was out of the question. So what would he do? Well, he and Theodosia had built a beautiful home there on the Hudson, I believe, and they sold that to John Jacob Astor, and with that, well, she was dead, but Burr used the money to buy a boat and went sailing up the Mississippi. And this is where he got into his next.
And we have about 4 minutes. So
oh my goodness.
We have to move.
Oh, then I'll move. So anyway, he there got in touch with General James P. Wilkinson, who was quite an enterprising man. It turned out, we learned after his death, that he was a double agent, a spy for the Spanish who were there on the western side of Florida. But the two of them and Burr, they wrote each other in code, and when it was decoded, it found out that Burr had gotten together a force of 500 men, equipment, and so forth and so on, and had planned at a certain place in the Ohio to cross into what was Mexican territory, owned by Spain. I think they gave Mexico its freedom in 1820 or something. But anyway, they were all planned to go. Burr apparently had talked with the natives, and the natives were in agreement on this as long as they could keep their religion, which was Catholic, and would be treated nicely. But this was aired abroad, and Burr was called to Richmond in 1807 for a trial of
treason.
Of being a traitor.
Yeah, of being a traitor.
Wilkinson denied what was in the letter with all the details that Burr would be the head of this nation, Wilkinson would be second in command and in charge of all the military. And it went on, and finally they called John Marshall, Justice of the Supreme Court, and he came and gave his decision, his definition of treachery, that it existed only when a country was at war. Mm-hmm. Okay, so all Burr had to do was pay the court fines and fees, and he was a free man. Mm-hmm. But what would he do now? He was a man without a country, if you will.
And he was sort of marked in a way.
So he went abroad, and England, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, the Scandinavians, to see if he could get any money to support his efforts. He even approached Talleyrand to see if Napoleon could help him out. Of course, Napoleon at the time was fighting his own war in Europe.
Stuff. Yeah, exactly.
So all of that came to naught, and he, penniless, hopped on a French ship, which was taken, I guess the British, and finally he got to England, and in 1812 returned to the United States, continued his practice in New York, mostly dealing with widows or women, mm-hmm. one of whom he married. She and he had nothing in common except her money, which he used for his further amorous affairs and also his affair. So she sued for divorce shortly after their marriage, and in New York you had to have physical evidence of infidelity, if you will, so that stretched out for quite a while. Mm-hmm. His daughter, Theodosia, wanted to visit him, and she hopped on a ship to come up, but the ship sank and she was drowned.
Oh, gosh.
And so there he was in penury as a bit, but he carried on and died in 1836. The body was taken to Princeton University. If you go there now, you'll find in the presidential burial ground Jonathan Edwards and Andrew Burr Sr. Next to that, you'll find Andrew Burr Jr. The end of really a very interesting
It really
character.
Is interesting, and we have like 30 seconds. But I just wanted to say back to the duel, I read in Wikipedia that it was the same dueling grounds where Hamilton's son had been killed the year before.
And
in a duel.
And Hamilton claimed he didn't like dueling, but he was a smooth guy also. And
Well, Jack, this has been, I think we left the audience wanting more, but I really think this was a fun show to do.
Well, I enjoyed doing it, and particularly with you,
And
Fran.
we'll have to do, you know, Jack was supposed to do this show with Eck Music, which, as you know, we lost as a host, and so I'm second choice, or maybe third choice. I don't know.
You're always first with me, Fran.
Thank you, Jack.
And Eck, wherever you are, a rather mild tribute to you. But
yes,
anyway,
it is a tribute to him, because you all had already prepared to do this. Okay.